Good afternoon and welcome to Invariance Dialogue for Change, Navigating Political Conversations at Work. If you have questions for our panelists throughout the event, please put them in the chat box. Invariance Dialogue for Change series facilitates conversations on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for companies and members of the policy community interested in engaging on cultural and business issues. I'm Caroline Swan, Chief People Officer at Invariant. I lead all elements of Invariant's people function, including employee experience, leadership and development training, talent acquisition and management, strategic planning, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives. I'm really excited for today's conversation. It's no secret that America is facing a stark political divide, and soon we're going to be in the depths of yet another polarizing presidential election. As social, cultural, and issues take center stage, political conversations are most certainly to become supercharged. Today, we've got two great panelists who are here to talk about that with me. And some background, there's really great news out there that we're going to dive into, which is that 2/3 of Americans are really not interested and are very much tired of all the political divisions. And that's encouraging. So there is some hope on the horizon. But today we're going to talk about a roadmap for companies and individuals who can foster positive conversations at work, particularly in times of political indifference. And so I'm pleased to introduce our two guest speakers. Chief Knowledge Officer of the Society for Human Resource Management, Alexander Alonso, leads intelligence, insights, and innovation functions. He is a renowned leader and enhancing the workplace culture, and the author of Talking Taboo, How to Manage Polarizing Conversations at the Workplace.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here, Alex. We're excited to have you. And also with us is Kimberly Rayner-Smith. She's an executive coach and she's a director with Bain & Company. In her position, she leads all employee coaching program in the Americas. Kimberly helps employees manage challenges, build their career paths, and reach their full potential at work. She also advises leadership on how to manage their teams and create a positive work environment. So welcome to the both of you. I'm going to go ahead and dive in. Let's start talking simply just about tools that individuals can use to make political conversations more productive and positive, and whether at the workplace or even at home. Kimberly, I'd like to turn to you. Are there specific communication techniques that employees can employ to express differing viewpoints without alienating their colleagues?
Well, first, thank you, Caroline, for having me. And I apologize for the group. I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is awful. But so wonderful to be here today. In terms of tools and things to think about, the bottom line is coming from a place of curiosity and interest. Like when we are engaging in a conversation, no matter the topic, you have to think a little bit about the group and the dynamic as an individual. And I would say the same at home and or with friends. So if I'm with a group of friends, do I trust this group? Do I feel comfortable sharing my opinion, whether it's filtered or unfiltered? We all have natural biases and information that we leave in and out. And it's a little bit of like understanding the group that I'm in and the dynamic that I'm in. Is this the right one at work or in a particular group that I want to share, that I feel comfortable sharing? Is that trust there? And then also thinking about my intention. Am I saying something to piss people off? Am I saying something because I'm genuinely curious? Like, Alex, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? So a lot of this is a bit of that internal dialogue. And I try to think about the simplest tool. Honestly, it's that place of curiosity. Caroline and I could disagree about something, but man, I'm curious about what she thinks, because maybe that informs my own decision, or maybe that informs the way I'm thinking about it, or maybe I'm going to say, well, she just plumb wrong. I think totally differently, but yeah, it's still creating the space for that dialogue.
So Kimberly, thanks for that. I agree. I think it's important to come from a place of curiosity, because it really does, as you say, it opens to just wanting to learn more, right? And one of the questions that I have, and the rule that I grew up with was it was not polite to talk about politics at the dinner table or money. And so given the topic today, Alex, I'm just curious, should we be engaging in political conversations at work, and what are the best practices if we do?
So it's so funny you reference that that rule, because I always think about my grandmother's rule, which was you don't talk about anything having to do with power, politics, or church, religion, anything like that in the at the home, at the dinner table, anywhere. And I wish that I could bury my head in the sand the way that she suggested. And I love my grandmother; she was wonderful. But what I found is from our research is 92% of working Americans report experiencing at least once per year a political polarizing discussion that just pops up, and either admitting that they engaged in it or admitting that they witnessed in it. In fact, 40%, almost 36% of them say they have engaged in it and actually enjoyed it, which is sort of interesting. And when you look at our data, one of the things that stands out, just in 2022 alone, we saw there were 5 topics that really sort of drove what was the polarizing discussion. And it was things having to do with COVID, no surprise there. Presidential elections, number 2. Impeachment, number 3. And number 4 was everything having to do with what are we going to experience in 2024 when we have the next election. Number 5 was one that I always find amazing, but it was everything having to do with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard and their trial. Right. And everybody laughs when I tell that, but it's sort of funny. We had 4 things that were all about politics before we even got into that, which is your total water cooler talk. In relation to your question, what we found is that there are some guides that really are critical. First and foremost, I totally echo what Kimberly was saying. In fact, I think of the words that my colleague Irshad Manji, who heads up a program called Diversity Without Division, she highlights 2 key factors. First and foremost, listen to learn, and tell somebody that you are listening to learn. Actually come out and say it. And the second kind of practice or behavior that people highlight, or she highlights, is use the phrase, tell me more. Rather than asking your question or attacking, say, tell me more, because it indicates that you are listening and want to hear what someone is saying. In addition, I think that there is a second set that you sort of need to focus on in terms of skills, tools, and what have you, which is once you're engaging in them, you really need to have the skills that say, what is this making me look like? And what is this causing in terms of an outcome for other people? In other words, what will they walk away having experienced because I chose to engage in this? Those are questions that people don't want to think of in the moment, but that self-reflection will take them much further.
So that brings me to a great question then, in terms of building off of what Kimberly said about coming from a place of curiosity, and your mention of coming from a place of how do I look in this moment? Kimberly, how do you take the conversation away from, and I think that Alex gets to that point a little bit of like, how do you take the conversation away from like, I gotta win? I mean, look, we're in DC, we come from a DC area, we're very, there's a lot of politics around us, a lot of individuals engaged in politics. And there's also that mindset, right, of enjoying the debate, to somebody enjoying the challenge of having the debate. So how do you shift, Kimberly, how do you show up in such a way that gets to the point of wanting to learn more and away from the winning of the conversation?
Oh, it's a great question, Caroline, because I think we all love to be right. And there is no right or wrong in some of this. And I think it's hard for people to come into something that they might feel passionate about. And I may not know that. Like if Alex is telling me about his grandmother, maybe he's very passionate about that, but I don't know that. And if I say something that makes him angry, how am I going to know that? And so first, again, we come back to this idea of the intention and the conversation and that trust. And there's a lot of internal dialogue. And that's that strong self-reflection in them. So when you're in a dialogue and you feel like, oh my God, I just want to win, I just want to beat this person, I want to have the right point, it's almost catching yourself and going, is this really what I want from this? I love this listening to learn idea. And I wonder, it's like, how could you bring that in to switch that mindset a bit? So if I'm feeling that strong urge to win, and I think we all know what that feels like, it's like, I got one more point, I got something else I'm going to say. Would I take a step back, take a deep breath and go, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing your opinion. I'm still really curious though. Like, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? Something that you could use that diffuses that feeling.
Mhm.
And I would also argue that if it is truly uncomfortable, though, if it's going further than that, which it can, how comfortable would you be just stepping out? Something like, I just thought of that that we've even said to our kids before, sometimes expressing your feeling, what you said, I don't know why, but it really just sat poorly with me.
Mhm.
You bring some of that personal piece in, it automatically reduces the competition. No feelings are wrong. They're all valid. And I feel
Mhm.
like that diffuses it a little bit from the winning. Alex,
Mhm.
I'd love to hear what you think about that.
It's so interesting that you reference that and expressing the feeling, because what we've found in our work, and we collected about 1,700 different examples of workplace polarizing discussion just over the 2022 period. What struck me was it 6% of those examples resulted in some sort of workplace aggression. And what I mean by that is the win had to jump to something that was really uncomfortable, which is what you were describing, Kimberly, which was people coming to blows. What I sort of think of it, which is sad, right? But I think about some wisdom that we've picked up just from exploring these 1,700 examples, which speaks to the notion of a win really isn't a win. And one of the things that we've identified in terms of this research is people managers play an important role in helping people see the other side of the equation. And it's largely because they have a sway over someone's performance and a sway over the outcomes that they have in the workplace. But what's interesting is if a people manager is ready and able to identify, you may win over that individual in this moment, but you will have lost credibility more broadly. That is a real kind of determinant of whether or not somebody will engage in this behavior in the future. So sharing that kind of thinking and saying, don't think about winning over that individual, think about winning in terms of your credibility, that immediately sort of diffuses what people will do in the future. And I personally, I don't want to digress too far, but it makes me think back to a time in graduate school. I was in graduate school in Miami during the Elian Gonzalez moment, right? And for Cuban Americans like me, that was a real politically charged discussion. I remember I had a colleague who I went to high school with. His dad was my high school football coach and everything. And I'll never forget, we had a disagreement about this, very public. He was very pro what had happened. I was very opposite that. And sure enough, we came to blows in the workplace. And I'll never forget what our supervisor said to us, or advisor said to us: you guys are idiots, because you're looking at this issue now, not thinking about what everybody else is seeing you two do, and how that has hurt and damaged your credibility across the board. And to this day, she's the president of University of Colorado in Denver. It still sticks with me, and I can't see her. I'm still ashamed of it. So,
Oh, yeah, it's akin to, winning the battle but losing the war almost,
exactly.
right? So we have a great question from the audience that and I think it's on par with what we're talking about. So I'm gonna go ahead and read it. So Leif Larson asks, many people have beliefs that they think everyone must believe and do not think they're making a statement that could ever be considered divisive, right? They're like, well, everybody must feel this way. So how can you take a second and rethink, how should I say this? How can we advise? I think part of what people are taking from this is how do we advise the teams that we're working with, the individuals at our place of business, in terms of how to approach the campaign season, right? That's a big piece of this. So how do you, Alex and Kimberly, and I'll start with you, Kimberly, how do you take a second to, just as you talked about, pull back and say, okay, I don't want to win the battle to lose the war? How can you talk and advise your teams on that?
Boy, I mean, it's tough, because what I love about that question is that it's right. There's so many things that could ruffle a feather, and you're not coming from that place of trying to win, or maybe you're not coming from a place of trying to be polarizing. And it's again coming back a lot to the self game and understanding the right place and time for maybe to be talking, to create the debate, etc. But interesting, coming back to the workplace comment and what Alex was starting to talk about, it's also thinking about the environments that we all are in. A lot of this needs to come a bit from the leadership down and the tone that they're setting in the company. So maybe you're in a company that loves debate. I can't even imagine that personally, because I too grew up with no politics, no religion, and it still makes me a little uncomfortable. But, maybe the organization encourages it, maybe it wants it, and they're setting that tone. Maybe that other companies are doing something different and creating a time and a place for good debate, but setting the rules and the tone around it. And it does sit a bit with our managers to be able to step in if things are really going off the rails, and saying, hey, let's take a pause. Taking a pause, coming back to the question of Caroline, is probably the biggest tool I can give. If you think it's going to be at all risky, is it worth saying?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like whenever, when you're like, should I wear this shirt to work? Well, if you're questioning it, don't wear the shirt to work.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost in that same, I don't know, it's very simple, but it's like, if you're starting to question it, maybe come again, rephrase it and come from a place of curiosity. I know that Biden is president, but what do you think about Biden?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of making an opinion about him and then putting it out there,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Mm-hmm.
that could be a simple reframing and using the pause and I do want to hear about Caroline's opinion on this. How do I frame it in a way so I can get more of her opinion or more of a conversation between us, if that makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So interestingly, we've actually seen the gamut. We've run the gamut in terms of what it is that organizations are doing, and there are some who are being very active, and then there are others who are taking a sort of a more measured approach to ask for that self-reflection. I'll share an example of an organization that, without naming the organization, that actually has taken a very proactive approach, in large part because they're a law firm and they're a law firm in the policy space, and the debate is innate to their very culture. They call it the hot bench, if you will. And one of the things that stands out is they've actually taken a very measured approach to say, okay, we are going to actually talk about this. We're a year out from this. Let's have direct conversations. So let's have people managers actually host forums, and we'll talk topically about specific topics. But there's one rule. Everybody comes into this forum and will share their perspectives, but you'll share your perspective after having thought about 3 issues. First and foremost, 1, what does this do to your perception or how people perceive you in the workplace? Number 2, what does this do to your overall team? Will people begin to question your team because you're sharing something in a way that is in some way might be damaging to the team? And then the third thing is, how is this actually going to help us achieve our workplace outcome? The outcomes that we're required to do, and they call it the me, we, work kind of framework, and it's something that they live upon, but they make it a reflection tool that they ask people to do or engage in before they come and have a structured kind of polarizing discussion.
I mean, Alex, just to add to that, I know other organizations have created similar forums, but they haven't put that criteria in place. So I find that really interesting. But creating the space, there's no Zoom, they're sending out a bunch of materials ahead of time and allowing a broader discussion. And I've participated in a few of these, and it's fascinating, but man, it's neat to see and hear all the different opinions, especially if you have good facilitators. And this is where the leadership team needs to show up. The one that I sat in, our office head was there, and I'm like, nah, that's a good call, right? Because again, it sets the tone and shows that he cares about this, and he cares about the, people bringing in different perspectives and opinions,
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it actually brings me to my next point. And that is that, like, some employers, they've tried to ban political discussions at work. I'm thinking about their concern around creating that workplace safety and not having the discord. And one particular one that's a good example here is Basecamp CEO Jason Fried. And he announced that there would be no societal or political discussions on the company account or anything around the companies. And over 1/3 of the staff resigned. So he ultimately had to issue an apology to that. And so instead of trying to limit free speech, I'm wondering if companies should be instead focusing on, just as you talked about, creating those political norms around the dialogue and making sure that, there's some rules in place in terms of how to approach. Alex, I'm just curious, how do you think, you talked a little bit about, having the conversation that, and I like the me, we, work example, but what are the benefits of having political dialogue conversations, as we're talking about? Like, why would a company want to go headfirst into that arena?
So, what we found is actually that aside from preventing what we call parking lot polemics, which, I've sort of found very interesting. People will actually take their discussions straight to the parking lot if they're still with your organization. They will have them in the parking lot, and it really turns into a whole other discussion. What
Wow.
happens is when you ban the notion of political discussion, people are going to engage in them anyway. They'll find different forums to do it, and more importantly, it will actually point them in the direction of your culture. They'll say that our culture is not strong enough to hold these types of discussions and to have moments when we disagree, moments when we have specific views that we can't tolerate and we can't engage in or share. So when you look at this, one of the things that stands out, at least at the organizational level, is you start to see impact on turnover right off the bat, because people say, this is not the kind of culture I want to be in. They don't trust me to be an adult, so to speak, right? I think of the old GM adage, which is you say to people, dress accordingly. That's their dress code, right? If you have to have that defined, you don't belong in our culture. But one thing that sort of stands out is that's the first thing that you see. The second thing that you'll see is you'll actually see people who are bad actors stay within the culture and engage in weaponization of the culture. And so when you think about that, what you'll start to see is you'll see everything from counterproductive behavior that is gossip to counterproductive behavior like having HR investigate someone who holds an opposite view. We've seen examples of that from Google all the way through. And then the third thing that you'll see is weaponization that is basically starting to eliminate or create bias in the practices, the employment practices around those individuals who are different and not part of the in-group, so to speak. So you're just creating a situation where you're about to have a culture that cannot tolerate that. And more importantly, a culture that will be seen as less than the employer of choice. So it's not so much the benefits of having the political discussions. I think you start to create trust in that regard, but the issue that you run into is actually much greater if you start to ban this type of discussion.
Right. No, it's true. I mean, you don't want to have a culture that is one that doesn't have the trusting and the ability to really kind of question our views and our ideals and everything, and constantly be looking to grow from that, right? But a big piece to that is to creating safe space. So Kimberly, how do you create that safe space? How do you create the environment in which people feel like they can go and have those types of conversations?
Yeah, and Alex made such an interesting point, because the culture is a big part of why people are attracted to companies, stay in companies. And unfortunately, this does sit with the company to think about, how do I foster and create this culture? It can be, there's so many different ways to build culture. And when I think about safety, so maybe it is something as simple as forums and avenues to have discussions about a variety of topics. But at the same time, it's also coming back to what are some of the company values and norms. So I can speak to my own, but at Bain, we have a phrase called "Bainey never lets another Bainey fail." And it comes with this idea that I got your back and I will be there if you need my help. So that when things get if something were to go off the rail, a manager or leader could step in and say, hey, let's just pause here for a second and come back to, this is a norm of the organization. We support all perspectives and all views because we're better for the collective strength of the group, right? And I think that's part of it. Thinking about the norms and the values, and what are some of the words that you use that make people really believe it and live it. Two, I think it's right, is figure out what forums in the company that would allow for it. I think, like you shared that example, that's one extreme. The other extreme is to ignore it altogether, right? And there's got to be this, like, somewhere in between. Should a company get involved? Should they make a statement if something were to happen in their particular state and their country? And I know that we've had multiple forums on different topics. We've also had storytelling sessions at some of our office meetings that I have found to be amazing. 3 to 5 minutes of someone getting up and sharing a particular story, and you're running the gamut of the stories you're hearing. But it shows all the different things that people bring. This is what makes a company better. Thank goodness. People from different places, all different walks of life. Yay, thank goodness. And it's something to celebrate almost, that we're
Mhm.
celebrating what you're bringing. And I can't wait to hear about your story. And oh my God, now Alex, I'm dying to know about growing up like in Miami and Cuba. I'm like, I'm fascinated. But that's a great story to tell. And so it's celebrating some of the stories, creating the forums, and coming back to the scaffolding of it all. Where are the norms and the values of the organization?
Mhm.
And
So,
it's fascinating. I'm Carolyn, I apologize, but I'm going to
no,
just
please.
something that
Yes.
Kimberly said there, in large part because what ends up happening is there is true value in that storytelling approach. And we've seen it actually change cultures. It helps the culture evolve as well. I think about what we saw pre-pandemic as it relates to mental health and what
Mhm.
we
Oh my
see
God,
today, right? It's a total difference from what we see today. And people are having that impact of storytelling coming from the top down all the way through, change the way that they operate as an organization. What I find, though, is interesting, and stepping away from that mental health discussion, one thing that I find is interesting, if you don't have these kind of avenues, these safe spaces, what you'll find is these things are happening, not just in different places, but on different systems. I can't tell you the number of times I've had a leader from an organization come to me and say, we have a culture that these are our guiding principles, these are our values, but the subculture data lives on Slack. And you
Mhm.
go through all the channels on Slack and you see what people are actually debating, having, and really finding. And the stories they tell on Slack are powerful, but nowhere near what the organization wants.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, you really, we often hear across as when you have that, you have that counterculture, if you will. It really erodes in terms of the safe spaces and things. I'm going to take a moment and turn to the question that we got in the chat box, and that is, many firms hire people from one political side or another, someone who worked for one administration or another, and mix and match people from the left and the right. You often, the bipartisan firms, right? How can you keep a team effort at a firm when you toss people together who at one time were on the opposite side of an agenda and now they're playing on the same team? So how do you create that cohesion? How do you get them moving and rowing in the right direction? Alex, I'm going to turn that first to you, and then we'll go to Kimberly.
I think specifically about my experience around the policy space. And one of the things I found is people are willing to actually work together. Everybody knows that to get anything done, you have to actually work with both sides and work with everyone. And so when I think about firms, and in particular firms where the politics of an individual are known as they come into the firm, you will go ahead and you'll see that those groups actually will work together regardless of what their agendas were in different administrations. What is fascinating to me, though, is there is one thing that employers do really well when it comes time to actually hire people from different ends of a political spectrum. And that's be honest about what your culture is while you're recruiting these individuals. If you're honest, and I'll share with you an example of something we do here at SHRM. If you're honest about what your guiding principles are and what we operate by, it will be fascinating how quickly you turn off people that don't fit within that, and people who do fit within it will seek to be part of that. At SHRM, and the example here at SHRM is we have a fairly defined, very transparent culture. But one of the things that we have as a guiding principle is challenge, decide, and commit. And in large part, what we were trying to get people to recognize is we are going to be very direct about the kind of feedback that you'll receive. You are entitled and, more importantly, required to engage in challenging anyone when someone comes to you with an idea and saying, how does this really fit? Can we make this better? The whole notion of a hot bench, right, brought to life at a nonprofit, where you're basically saying, as we go to new things, new different policy perspectives, what have you, we're going to challenge you. But once we decide, we're all committing to that. And getting that notion from people that says, once something has been decided, you are going to commit, will help with this exact issue. But you're also going to find that a lot of people won't be able to commit and are really open about that when they are being recruited. If they're open about that, very likely in this market, they're not going to want to be part of your culture, and that's okay.
Kimberly, do you have a similar experience at Bain?
Probably, well, definitely. But the norms and the values of the company have been around for a while, and I think have evolved all for the better. I think more tactically, if I was a manager and I had and knew that people were coming in from a lot of different political sides, left, right, whatever, like anything, when you start in the beginning, it's got to come back to those norms and those values. And you collectively as a group going, okay, what are we agreeing as a norm? Could be as simple as my working hours are 9 to 6, and I don't want to hear from anybody after 6. It also has to be about debate and discussion. And what are we all agreeing to as a group? And using that as the backbone of the work that goes together collectively. Are we all in agreement that this is our goal, that this is our vision? And that's why it's so important for companies and groups to make sure the strategy, the vision is clear. This is what we're in for. This is what I'm here to do. This is what I'm excited to be a part of. If I'm not, to Alex's point, you're almost self-select out. You're like, this is not what I wanted. This is not an organization that resonates to me. And that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it probably comes up more and more if I think about this person's already getting in the company, and then what happens when you're working in the group and how you bring it together. And you would hope that the group would be stronger, bringing in different views and different perspectives. But I think the norms and values are so important. And we just, ironically, my group, I'm in the wellness group at Bain. We just had a discussion about our norms this morning and our vision, because it's evolving a bit. But everybody has a voice. Everybody's got something to say. It's sent out to us multiple times, so we all have input. But we're all agreeing to this and agreeing to the intention in this space that if I were to say something, maybe it goes against what somebody else thinks, but that there's room for that. And that comes again back down to always a scaffolding on trust, intention, the norms, and the values. I think those are 4 really big things here.
Yeah. And so, you put those in place, and it's interesting you mentioned that you guys were kind of revisiting that as a team.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is, there's going to be moments where to the scaffolding, it gets a little wobbly, right? Like maybe something comes up and it's heated, like a George Floyd moment or something. So I'm curious, like, would you, in your capacity as a coach, Kimberly, do you recommend to leadership that they revisit those values and where the norms are and what the focus is on a consistent basis, and how often should they be doing that?
Goodness, the how often part, I'm not entirely sure. Probably more often than not, especially as new people are coming in. But coming back to your point, yeah, when something happens, it's a great opportunity to come back to it, and seeing and checking in and understanding how it's impacting others if you don't know. Be curious. And if you are a manager or a leader and you're noticing that someone on the team is really upset, man, your job is to check in and find out what's going on and to shut it down if it starts getting ugly, or if you're noticing something. I think it's asking a lot for leaders. I hear you, but this is part of building some of that muscle and the ways that you would do it. Some people are very quiet and just kind of listen into the group. Others might have a bigger voice. But as a leader, you still have to find out what's your groove and how do I want to manage this. So my best advice is you got to get in there. Let's pause. Let's hold on for a second. Maybe this is a chance. And if we're noticing it coming up a lot, that we need to go back to our norms and talk about what's going on with the group. Do we need to have a discussion as a group about George Floyd and how you all felt with it? Let's all make sure we're agreeing to what space we want to create for this. But I agree. I think there's so many different things.
There are. And I think one of the things that you have to be careful of is that, political speech and political division can sometimes eventually, if it gets pretty ugly, as you guys have talked about, it can turn into hate speech and it can get to a harassment moment, right? Like there's times where it can really quickly go downhill. And so, Alex, I'm just curious, like, how do employers and employees distinguish political speech from harassment or hate speech? And how do you really create those divisions and ensure that everything is staying above board and the team is really feeling in that sense of safety as well?
So I wish that there was a clear-cut answer. And I think specifically about what Kimberly was describing in terms of your guiding principles and your value in terms of the cycle that you should review them on, or at a minimum, just look at them. In my mind, what I think we've seen over the course of the employer community, or the breadth of the employer community, is really people take hate speech as something that is genuinely hate speech, meaning that it is something that is related to the putting down and or kind of harming of a particular group, a particular individual, what have you. Where we see employers really struggling is, how do you take political statements that are related to hate speech kind of beliefs or thinking, right? And doesn't matter what side you're on, that's the thing where employers really struggle. When we look at this, what we've actually advised organizations to do is do one of two things. First and foremost, it's really take a tabletop kind of exercise and say, okay, where is it that we view all the different scenarios whereby we would have responded with this is hate speech and this is something that we just will not tolerate. What is our line, so to speak? The other thing that we sort of advise, though, is having a black swan kind of identification activity and saying, okay, what is the black swan activity related to political speech, related to hate speech, related to the kind of representation or communications of individuals within our organization that will cause us to experience severe harm, cause us to experience the kind of thing where we start to question whether or not the organization will be around much longer, if the enterprise is going to be hurt. And when you engage in that activity, what it does is it inadvertently, it takes that line and it says, okay, here's where I know we are going to respond so vehemently, so violently, that this is where we're going to really take a real countermeasure to what people are putting out there in the world of hate speech. That's where we see people really kind of taking that event and really defining what Black Swan means to them.
Alex, what is Black Swan? I don't know.
So Black Swan,
yeah.
You know, it's interesting. There are so many different things that kind of fall into the space of Black Swan.
Okay.
In many cases, it's something that actually threatens the livelihood of your organization. I think of it in the context of Boeing as an example, not because I want to call Boeing out by any stretch, but if you look at what they experienced from a Black Swan event phenomenon, they had issues with the 737 MAX 8, and that caused issues that were, one, put them in the space of being a B2C organization when they had traditionally been a B2B organization, but two, caused a situation where people had an erosion of confidence in what Boeing was producing. And so that's the kind of thing that happens with the Black Swan event. Most organizations don't go far enough to actually do that type of Black Swan event around talent issues and around things that deal with political and hate speech. That's the kind of thing I think we should be doing more of.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting you say that, because that kind of goes to my next question, which is, we've talked a lot about the individuals who are vocal, the individuals who want to get in that arena and they want to fight and they want to push for their views. But what about the individuals who don't want to speak up? And how do you make sure that you include them in the conversation? And to your point on the Black Swan event, how do you make sure that going back to that psychological safety piece, right? How do you make sure that individuals feel that sense of comfort if they do want to speak up? Not everybody wants to engage. Maybe they're like you and I, and we grew up, no politics, no religion, we don't talk about those things, and that's fine too. But you also don't want to create any sort of area in which they're isolated, right? So Kimberly, I'm going to ask you first. How do you make sure that those individuals that are underrepresented, who are not really feeling the confidence to speak up, but maybe do have an opinion and they do, how do you get them to engage in the conversation, but in such a way where it's safe, it's comfortable, and they also don't feel like they're on the back of their heels?
Boy, what's tough about this question is, because I struggle with this as a coach, because I know that authentically not everybody wants to speak up or feel and they may not have to. If it's part of their job, meaning I just had a woman I coached earlier today, and we were talking about her voice, and she's like, Kimberly, I've got to get my voice more into these meetings, but I'm naturally quite introverted. Oh, that's tough, because you also want to be credible. You want to have sway with your clients, within the team. And so, okay, I was like, well, how do we find what's authentic to you? We all know that the loudest voice in the room isn't always the smartest voice in the room. And this is finding some of that leadership style and authenticity with it. So if we notice that somebody in the team is consistently not speaking up, it does come back again to the manager saying, hey, Alex, I would love to hear your opinion about this. Maybe it's me checking in with Alex later on and saying, hey, is it okay that I called you out when we were talking as a group? Do I set that norm from the beginning? Group, we're all going to talk about this today, and just know that as a facilitator, I'm going to call out each one of you because I want to hear each one of your voices regarding a particular topic. again, we're coming back to those norms and things that I keep going on and on about, but setting that within the group means that Alex knows I'm probably going to come to him and say, hey, Alex, I would love to hear what you think about this. So that's one thing I would think of. Two is definitely checking in with the person. You know, it's like, do you want to speak up? I'd love to hear your opinion, but I also know that if it's not what you want to talk about, that's fair too.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's so hard about this question, because I'm like, part of me is like, I don't want to make them that uncomfortable, but if they need to, how do we create space for them to do that?
Right.
You know, and that also then comes back to the organization. Do we have forums where someone might feel more comfortable talking? Are they more comfortable talking with their peers? We were talking about, I got trained as a mental health first aider in our company, right? And would someone who's much younger than me feel comfortable talking to me? Would they rather talk to someone who is in the same place that they are, looks the same way that they do? Maybe, you know, and you have to have that type of representation and space for different people to talk, you know? Like, I love talking to other women who are in the same place where I am in my life, but man, it's so nice to talk to someone who's not. But
Mm-hmm.
it's different for every person. And God bless the organizations that we've got more options for them now. But
Mm-hmm.
still, those are all the things that come up. I feel like I'm rambling.
You're
Alex.
not rambling.
Not at all. Not at all. I'm taking notes. So one of the things that sort of stands out to me is, and I came across a leader who actually tried something different in this space, and I thought it was sort of interesting. Every time they had a leadership team meeting, so this was their core 10 leaders, one of the things that they did was they actually set up a parking lot at the
Yeah.
beginning of the room, and the only way, or at the entry point to the room, and the only way you could enter the room was by sharing your perspective on the key topic of the day, whatever the topic was. And it became more politically charged kind of things. Now, he wasn't really keeping people out of the room, but what he was doing was asking people to kind of share their perspective without necessarily assigning it to them or forcing them to speak loudly. What he would then do is, with his CHRO, he would go ahead and identify where it was that there were key themes, how the opinions sort of were distributed, and then identify who it was that sort of called this out and said, talk to me about why are you building this perspective? What is it is really a part of this perspective? So the notion of the safe space where there isn't any judgment, but we're going to hear how everybody kind of falls out on this particular topic. And it became the kind of thing where people felt more comfortable sharing their perspective, and those introverts in the room started to share much more than they used to. What I will say is the one caveat with that is you end up spending much more time talking about the topic of the day than you do the running of the business, right? But but there's some value in that as well.
Well, we used a parking lot with our when I did my coaching training, and the parking lot was always for questions, opinions, and other things, so that it didn't dominate the day's training or what did we need to focus on that day. And then as the training progressed, a lot of the parking lot questions got answered, but it still left room for people to speak up about something that they may be uncomfortable with or didn't want to bring to the group. It's like a literal parking lot, Alex, thinking back to the comment that you made about people duking it out in the parking lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, we're bringing it full circle. I think the parking lot is a great tool to use for managers, and to your point, to get them focused as well on what the business is at hand, not just the outside conversations that maybe the team while wants to engage on, also needs to put in the parking lot, right, to focus on why we're all here in the first place. So we're coming to the end of our program, and I've really enjoyed listening to you both. It's been so interesting, and I'm just curious, Kimberly and Alex, if you have any, closing thoughts you'd like to share, any parting comments. Kimberly, I'll start with you.
Oh, parting thoughts. Find your voice. You decide what's important to you is the best advice I'd probably give to anybody. I don't think it has to be. I do believe that there's a way that each of us find that's comfortable for us. And that's okay. There's no right or wrong. That's why these questions are hard and really thought-provoking. And you decide what's comfortable for you in an organization. You decide for you, do I want to talk about it? Do I want to bring it up? And if I leave you with anything, please be curious. That's what helps to get that growth mindset, to learn about different opinions, perspectives, and to invite that into your world.
It definitely diffuses the heat around the political conversation for sure. Alex?
No, there was a time in my career where I actually loathed introspection. And I did that because I felt that people were being too introspective and thinking so much about what they felt and what they were feeling on the job. Sometimes, you're an early manager and you say to yourself, I wish that people were just focused on getting the task done. As I've seen the rise of this kind of polarization and the willingness to kind of share the authentic self in the workplace, one of the things that I think is the most underrated skill that we have people thinking or using is introspection. And so I actually encourage organizations to build introspective skills so that people see what it is that they are doing and understand that their feeling may be shared more broadly by others, so that they need to really consider the other as well.
So important. That's a great point. Well, I want to say thank you to both of you for joining us today. I think the conversation's been really interesting and I've really enjoyed it. I want to thank everyone who has attended and listened and put questions in the chat box. Please be on the lookout for follow-up emails from Invariant for more details about Dialogue for Change speaker series and additional items on diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging resources. You can also find us on Twitter at Invariant and LinkedIn as well. So thank you to everyone and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.